Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little, and today I'm going to share with you a clip from a webinar that I taught where I went through over 30 hands at 1-2 no limit at Borgata, where I won $650 playing over the course of a few days. Now, I realize a lot of people look at my high stakes training material and they say this is not applicable to 1-2 no limit. And to be fair, I recognize that. Your opponents are not all going to be playing well. They're going to be making all sorts of blunders. So whenever I was playing, I would find the weak, tight, passive players who I could just run over until they made it clear they had the nuts, in which case I would fold almost everything, right? And I ran into maniacs who would just be raising and re-raising. I would call down with bluff catchers. And this resulted in me absolutely crushing the games because my opponents were making gigantic mistakes. Some people think that, oh, they're playing all sorts of random stuff. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Well, the answer is you pay attention, you figure it out, you adjust appropriately, and you crush them. And in my full 3-hour webinar, I go through those 30 examples to help you understand how you need to be adjusting to crush the small stakes players. At the end of this clip from the webinar, you can actually go and purchase the full webinar, and I have a discount code for you right down here below this video for 50% off. So I hope you enjoy this clip. I hope you learn a lot, and if you want to learn more, use the link below to save yourself some money. Good luck in the games, have fun, and I hope you learn a ton. All right, so this was early in the session. You see I have 200. I bought in for 200. I think you could actually buy in for a maximum of 300, but I wanted to try to simulate what I thought the standard, the standard conditions of a game, of most 1-2 games are. And the player stacks are ranging between like $40 and $400, give or take. All right, so anyways, second, third, fourth limp in. I limp in with 7-6 suited. The blinds come in as well. Flop comes 8-4-2. And I notate the suits when they matter. So here I have 2 spades, there's 1 spade on the board. And then the turn was not relevant. The turn suit was not relevant, at least for me. All right, so they check to me, and I bet $10 into the $13 pot with the double gut shot. Notice, with the gut shot. So notice a 5 gives me a straight. This is a spot where you can check or you can bet, but you have to realize that if you check, you're very likely not winning this pot. And if you bet and say one guy calls, there are going to be a lot of good turn and river cards for you to continue betting. And that's just because the board is all low. It'd be a little bit different if the board was something like Jack 8-4. I'd be a little bit less inclined to bet on Jack 8-4 than 8-4-2, because when the Jack is out on the flop, it's less likely an overcard or a scary card in general will appear on the turn. But on these low card boards, the board is almost certainly going to get scarier one way or the other. Either a straight card is going to come or an overcard is going to come. And that's going to give me more bluffing opportunities. Notice that actually if a 7 or a 6 comes, I get a pair, which is great. If a 5 comes, I have the nuts. If a 3 comes, I'm probably giving up. If an 8, a 4, or 2 comes, I'm also giving up. But any overcard, I'm usually going to be betting again. If one guy calls. If multiple people call, I'm usually just going to be done with the hand and not put any more money in the pot unless I improve. So that's my general strategy for the flop play. Someone's again saying no video. I honestly don't know what to do if there is no video on your end. I will be sending a recording to everyone, so be aware of that. And I'm also talking through everything. So worst case scenario, you'll hear me talking about them. But seems like everyone else has good video. Someone's suggesting reboot your computer if your video is not working. Or maybe re-enter the webinar or something like that. All right, so anyways, I bet the flop. One guy calls, one big blind calls. Big blind call usually is going to be some marginal hand. Like I said, it was fairly clear to me that people were calling with all sorts of junk just because they think that's what they're supposed to do. They would call with something like 5-4 here and get out of the way. All right, turns the jack. My opponent checks. This also implies my opponent checks whenever I don't write what he does. My opponent checks. I bet 18. He calls. So when he calls again, notice that I was betting 18 into a $33 pot, so about half pot. I was not necessarily trying to get my opponent to fold an 8 at this point with this bet. I was more so just trying to get him to fold all of his worst hands, the absolute trashy ones, and go from there. I thought if he had an 8, he'd probably call this bet, and I would usually be giving up on the river if an overcard did not come to the 8. I think an 8 is most of my opponent's range when he calls the bet is basically what I'm saying. He could also still be in here with 5-4 or ace-2 or something like that. But when the king came, that gave me a really clear bluffing spot. Of course, I shouldn't have a king too often, right? And I think a lot of high-stakes players will look at this and realize, oh, we shouldn't have a king very often. So I should be calling this a lot. But in the lower stakes games, I don't think people recognize when a scary card is not actually a scary card. I mean, given that I bet the flop, there is no way this king should have improved my hand. So I'm actually representing a very thin value range, but I don't think that really matters if your opponents just say, oh man, the jack came and the king came, now my 8 or my 4 or my 2 is obviously no good. And for that reason, I think it's the spot where I need to bet. So remember, the pot was 33 on the flop plus 8 plus 36, so 60 something, and I'm betting 52. I wanted to make a fairly large bet just to try to really ensure my opponent folds an 8 or worse. And he did fold. Usually in these spots, your opponents will tank forever, and you have to become very comfortable sitting there getting stared down. And I mean, I don't really have a problem with that because that happens in tournaments all the time, but I think a lot of the players in these games got really uncomfortable whenever they were getting stared at, and you have to become very, very comfortable with that if you are going to be bluffing in good spots. Dan asks, is the ace on the river a good card to bluff? Yeah, I'd be bluffing on any queen, ace, queen, or ace, king, or queen every time. A 10 or a 9, I would consider betting. 10 and 9s aren't quite as good because your opponent's 8 hands are usually going to be 10, 8, 9, 8, 8, 7, 7, 8, 6, etc., etc. If the river was a 7 or a 6, I'd probably not bet because I think it's going to be too likely that he is going to call with an 8 at that point. So that's my general plan. Ace, king, queen, I'm going to definitely continue betting. But I do think the turn bet gets the opponent off a lot of 4s and 2s, and maybe that's not accurate. Maybe the right play here is to bet more like 32 on the turn and then give up on all the rivers. But I'm a pretty big fan of firing 3 barrels whenever I have the opportunity compared to 2. I mean, well, there are some spots. Maybe we'll see some as we go through these hands. But this is a spot where it's very clear that if you bet the turn, you need to bet the river. So we pick up that pot right off the bat. It's always nice. All right, jack 4 of clubs on the button. So 3rd, 4th, low jack cutoff, limp, I raised to 18. So here's an example of this right off the bat. And remember, this was clearly in that range that I described earlier where it's not quite good enough to call. So I raise, and only the 3rd position guy calls, the initial limper. And someone said earlier that the first guy called, all of them call, but here's an example where it just didn't happen. One guy called and the others folded. So flop comes king 6-5, he checks, I bet 18, and I win. And notice that 18 is actually less than half pot, right? I think a lot of people, well, you have to realize, if my opponent calls this flop bets, I'm not going to say always, but quite often he will have a king or better. And if he has something like pocket 10s here, he'll just fold. And this is, of course, very player dependent, right? This is a spot where I think that this guy in particular, if I remember right, it was this probably 60-year-old guy who was somewhat conservative. I thought that he was one of these guys who's going to play very fit or fold. And that means that if he does not have a good hand, he's just going to get out of the way. And quite often these players, if they do have something like ace-king, they'll just check raise you or check raise all in or something like that right on the flop. And that makes your play really, really easy. Dave says that to them, the 18 bet may look like ace-king on a king XX board. And maybe it does, but really what betting 18 does is it allows me to bluff very cheaply. And also, it makes my opponent's errors significantly larger when they are folding the best hand. And also, whenever I do have a good hand, betting small will keep them in and quite often not allow them to make such easy folds with their reasonable hands. And so whenever I bet this, I recognize if my opponent calls, I'm probably done with it, unless maybe the turn's an ace. And I'm okay with that. And so my bet on the flop does not need to work very often at all to show a profit. And it's probably going to work something like 60 or 70% of the time. So seems like a pretty good spot to throw out the bluff. And this one worked as well. Dave asked, how often was I continuation betting? Richard says, I see that as on a 3, you are not done. I'm not sure what, I'm sorry, Samuel says that. I'm not sure what you're saying, Samuel. If the turn's a 3, I'm giving up, I'm not betting again on a lot of the turns. Oh, you say, okay, so say the turn's a 3, and I improve to a straight draw. Yeah, okay, so let's talk about that. Say the turn's a 3, I get a 4, and I make a straight draw. I'm probably not going to be betting on that card because when my opponent calls the flop, I think he has a king. And one thing I figured out really fast in these games is you are not trying to bluff your opponents off top pair. If your opponents have top pair, they are not folding. So if I think my opponent's going to stick around on the flop with only top pair or better, or primarily top pair or better, I'm just going to check behind the turn and try to realize my equity. If my opponent bet the river and I miss, obviously I fold. But if my opponent checks the river and I still have nothing, that would be a tough one. You could probably go either way, but your hand does not look like a king at that point, so I'd probably just give up. Then Nell says, what if you flopped a pair with the jack four? Well, if it's top pair, I'm probably going to still bet just as, I'm probably going to be betting 100% of flops for 18 in this scenario. There are really no boards where I think my opponent's going to defend 60% of the time, or something like that, which is roughly what he needs to be doing if I'm betting this size on the flop. So I think we can fairly blindly continuation bet in this scenario. And someone asked how often was I continuation betting, and I don't know the exact percentage or anything like that, but in heads up pots when check to, heads up 3-bet pots when check to, or heads up raise pots when check to, I'm betting pretty often. But multi-way, I definitely played it significantly more straightforward. And Robert says, was this one 15-hour session or did I break it up? No, this was, I think, 3 or 4 sessions. Well, actually, there's a question about that later that we will go over from someone who could not attend live. If you guys ever want to send your questions to the webinar ahead of time, or if you know you will not be here to attend live, feel free to email them in. And don't do that now, but if you wanted to email them in for the next webinar or something like that, definitely do that, and I'm happy to answer. All right, so ace king, low jack seat. I raised to 7, so I decided to make my standard raise to 7. I could easily see min raising being best in these games. And good and well, no one min raises in these games. They're all raising these to 7, 10, 15, or something like that pre-flop. Everyone at my table seemed to make it between like 8 and 10 pre-flop. I didn't encounter too many players who were blasting it to 20 or anything like that, although I'm sure they exist. I've heard about them. And very briefly, I guess, if you do see someone raising gigantic like that, just fold everything and wait for good cards. So you don't have to defend very often when your opponent's putting in $20 pre-flop. Don't feel like you have to call with ace jack offsuit and 8-7 suited and stuff like that. Just fold and wait for your top 5% hands. That makes the game really easy when they're blasting it. So anyways, I raised to 7. A cutoff tight guy goes all in for 60. So I was not loving making this call, but I don't really see how I could possibly fold. You have to realize when you have ace-king in your hand, facing an all-in, it's way more likely your opponent has either ace-king as well, or queens, jacks, or tens, and he has exactly aces. So you have to realize you're roughly flipping, and you do not need to win too often to profit. The way you have to figure out how often you need to win is you take the total size of the pot you will be getting in. So it'll be his 60 plus my 60 plus the blind, so 123. That's going to be the total pot. So we take how much more we have to put in, which is 53 divided by 123 equals. You see we need to win 43% of the time, right? And let's say we give our opponent a range like this. This is about as, well, let's say he's only shoving aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace-king, which I think most short stacks are certainly shoving. We have ace-king offsuit. You see we do win 40% of the time against this super nitty range, right? So if your opponent is legitimate super net, I need to win 43%, and I'm only going to win 40%, so I actually should fold. But I don't think too many people are that nitty. I mean, the guy only has 30 big blinds, so if he's shoving like ace-queen suited and pocket tens, notice that's not making the range much wider, but it starts to get very close to a call. And then if he starts shoving like ace-queen offsuit, pocket nines, then it becomes a very, very easy call. So anytime you're in a scenario like this, you have to realize that worst case scenario, we're losing a tiny amount, but best case scenario, we're profiting huge. And of course, if my opponent's really shoving a lot, like say he's shoving, ace-5 suited or something because he's blatantly crazy, then we have a very, very easy call. So Dave says that he finds a lot of older tight guys would do the same with king, king, or better when their stack is so short. Well, yeah, I think my opponent would do the same thing with kings or better. And notice that was in the range, right? I say he's shoving aces and kings. So it's not like I'm saying these are not part of his range. I was just saying that he's also going to be doing it with these other hands as well. You always have to be thinking about the total range. And against this absolute nit range of aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace-king, it's just barely, barely bad. So pretty easy call spot. He had pocket tens, I lose, and not much to that. Actually, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but I wanted to discuss it right now. Whenever I lost this hand, everyone at the table was like, "Oh man, tough luck." Like they were trying to console me for losing a coin flip. And I realized later that everyone in the games absolutely hated losing any significant pot. And you have to realize, like, this is an absolutely inconsequential hand, right? I did nothing wrong. My opponent did nothing wrong. We got it all in, and one of us is going to win, one of us is going to lose, and we move on. There's no point in acting as if you are unlucky or getting pissed because you lost or anything like that. And you definitely don't need to care about losing pots. I think a lot of the players at the table really hated losing pots and they hated getting outdrawn. And they were willing to throw a lot of value in the trash to ensure that that did not happen to them.